I'd like to welcome you to this very special presentation of Missing Links, the deep truth of our origin, history, destiny, and fate. In the last episode, I shared the new evidence that is absolutely shaking the foundation of modern science when it comes to the story of human evolution, us, and where we come from. Advanced CSI-like technology is now revealing DNA evidence in our time that Charles Darwin simply could not have known in his. The DNA that was supposed to represent our ancestors is now telling us a story. It's our story. And the story is that we are not the product of the long, slow process of evolution that we see for other forms of life. So I want to be very clear. DNA is telling us that evolution is a fact. It's just not our story. The DNA is also telling us that we did not descend from primitive beings, such as ancient Neanderthals. The DNA is telling us that we appeared on this earth suddenly, in evolutionary terms, as what are called now anatomically modern humans, AMH. We appeared about 200,000 years ago, and the thing is, we haven't changed since we appeared. So now that we know what we're not, and we know how quickly we did appear, the questions that come to mind are why and how. Why did we suddenly appear? Why did we show up on this earth 200,000 years ago, and how did it happen? Well, that's what this episode is all about. In this episode, we'll answer these questions, and in doing so, we're going to open the door to an even deeper mystery, because the answer to the mystery begins in our chromosomes. What you're seeing on the screen is a graphic representation. These are two separate chromosomes. So these were two chromosomes already existing in the primate genome, in the great apes and the chimpanzees. You're seeing a dotted line across those chromosomes. For a reason that we don't understand, we're not sure what happened, there was a break. Something broke or cut or sliced those chromosomes. And they were broken in a way that you're seeing on your screen right now. Portions of those were deleted. That material, the longer portions on the lower part of the graph, the lower part of the chart, it disappeared. So that material no longer exists. Above, the two portions that you see are now free actually came together and fused at the ends, as you're seeing on your screen right now. And that fusion created the longer human chromosome number 2. It makes 8% of the DNA, as I mentioned, in every cell in our body. However, that's not the end of the story, because after the fusion happened, as you can imagine, each of those chromosomes was independent unto itself before the fusion. So each of those chromosomes had information to help it function in the way that it did. When they were fused, when the two pieces came together, all of a sudden there were overlapping functions that actually would have made human chromosome number 2 less efficient. And to deal with that in a way that is not understood today, the overlapping functions were either turned off within the DNA, they shut down within the chromosomes, or completely removed altogether. That is what changes the story. So what we're looking at is the mystery of an ancient telomere to telomere fusion. The function, the precision, the timing with which this fusion happened, the fact that it happened quickly, the fact that it is so precise that certain redundant functions were removed and portions were deleted, it tells us that something more than evolution has happened here. Evolution, as we know it today, cannot and does not explain this fusion. And this fusion is key because it's the fusion that makes us human. It's the fusion that sets us apart from all other form of life. It appears to be intentional. And this is where we begin to kind of open the door to forbidden territory in science. So I'm sharing with you the science. This is peer-reviewed science that tells us what happened, and we've just done that. Now there's this gray, this shady kind of fuzzy area. Why would something like that happen? There appears to be an intent underlying this, and scientists don't know who or how or why, and I don't either for certain. I have my sense, my suspicions, but I'd like to explore some possibilities with you. Because the conventional thinking, when we hear about the fusion of DNA a long time ago and the way that happened, we're taught to think in binary terms. We say, well, it's either evolution, and if it's not evolution, it's creationism. Okay, creationism invoking religion, invoking God, invoking a lot of things that seem to be hot buttons for a lot of people, just because of the implications. And I think for that reason, that's why it has become forbidden territory in science. Science simply cannot prove these things. But there's a third option that has happened. For the fusion to occur the way it did, a mutation had to occur. That fusion is a mutation. It means that two genes mutated into the new human chromosome number 2, or two chromosomes mutated into the new human chromosome number 2. Because that is a mutation, the third option is now recognizing that. The third option is called directed mutation. Directed mutation. It means it didn't happen spontaneously from a natural process. Something directed the mutation. We don't know what it was for sure. And this is opening the doors to new possibilities in science and scientific thinking. So where and how that happened, that's where the study is going right now. And what the studies are showing us is telling a story that while it's new for science, in our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions, we've heard this story in different ways many times before. So when we talk about this directed mutation, it opens the door to one of the most controversial facets of evolutionary theory and the ideas and the beliefs that support it and do not. That is called intelligent design. Intelligent design, precisely what it says, that there is a design that is in place underlying the genetic structure of all life, and that some form of intelligence has been the one to direct that. For many people, this is where the religious implications come in. For me, it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be about religion. It may, but it doesn't have to be. But the strongest evidence, the strongest argument for what is called directed mutation and intelligent design comes from a principle that I alluded to in the previous episode, but I didn't really explain it very much because I knew we would here. It's called irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity. Here's what I mean by that. If you are walking in a field and you find a watch, okay? Watch lying on the ground, it is a safe assumption to make that some intelligence underlies the creation of that watch. The way the gears come together and interlock, and the way that those gears produce a function that is useful and meaningful, obviously reflects some intent, some design. And that's very different than if we were just to find a rock laying on the ground and we say, well, that rock may have been put there last week, it could have been there for 1 billion years, but it didn't necessarily take any intention to put it there. So I'm just using that as an example because some scientists are using this idea of irreducible complexity to validate this idea that there is some intent under this directed mutation. What irreducible complexity says to us, it says that a system can only work when all the pieces are in place to function at the same time. So when we think about our watch, it wouldn't work for one gear to show up, 100 years ago, and then another gear show up 100 years later, and then another gear show up 100 years later. I mean, the pieces may not even be there. They may corrode over those hundreds of years. So you get the idea of what I'm saying here. All the pieces for the watch have to be in place and available at the same time for that watch to become a watch and function as it does. That idea, that principle applies to so many facets of biological life. It's kind of like the idea of a mousetrap, and this is an idea that scientists use a lot when they're making this argument. If you look at a mousetrap, and it's a very simple mechanism, but if any one portion of that mousetrap were not there in the moment it was needed, it wouldn't function as a mousetrap. You could have the base, you could have the cheese for the bait, but if that spring isn't there, it's not going to be a mousetrap. If you have the spring and the cheese but no base, there's no contraption, there's no mechanism for it to work. So again, you're seeing this idea in principle. Let's take a look at what it means in real life. And this is so amazing when you really begin to think about these things. I mentioned the cells earlier. Our cells are so complex. Back in the early 1900s, cells were thought of as little bags, literally little sacks of fluid and some sticky gooey stuff. Scientists had no idea of literally the hundreds of thousands of mechanisms that have to be working in place in the cell at the same time. Such as the cell has to be able to nourish itself. So the cell has to be able to take in food, process that food in a way that is meaningful to the cell, and then distribute that beyond the cell to the rest of the body. If you're taking in that food, then somehow you have to eliminate that food. So the elimination system has to be there, or the cell won't live very long. So if the elimination system were there first, and the cell were not taking in food, that wouldn't work. If the food was coming in, the way to eliminate it, that wouldn't work. If the cell could not reproduce itself in some way to create another and another cell, or if the cell could not repair and heal itself in one way or another, then the cell's life wouldn't last very long. All of these things had to be in place at precisely the same time for the cell to work the way it works. Another place where we see this is with the function of human blood and the hemoglobins. There are 20 proteins that have to be in place simultaneously for the clotting of blood in our bodies. Now, I want you to think about what this means. 20 proteins, they have to be there. If they were not there with the first organism, the first time that organism received a cut or a scratch that we take for granted and is going to heal quickly, if those 20 proteins were not already in place, then the clotting couldn't happen, and that organism would bleed and bleed and bleed until it bled out, until it died. They have to be, if even one of those proteins is missing, the clotting mechanism doesn't work. And another place, I'm just going to give you another example so you see these aren't anomalies. The cilia. Cilia are the little wavy tails that we see on the ends of some kinds of bacteria. We see them on the ends of sperm, and that makes them really important because the sperm couldn't go anywhere to create life if they didn't have the cilia, the little tails. And many of the bacteria couldn't function the way they do without these. For those cilia to work, there is a very complex series of over 40 mechanisms that must be in place for the nerves, for the chemical reactions, for the growth of the cell, so that little tail can wiggle and move in a fluid medium. If they're not there all at once, they're not going to work. They cannot evolve slowly, gradually over a long period of time, just as the 20 proteins didn't, just as what's happening in our cells didn't. So what I am sharing with you now, just so very clear about this, irreducible complexity says that there are some forms of life that simply cannot evolve from simpler forms gradually, slowly over long periods of time. I've just given you 3 examples. Well, DNA is another example. DNA is a beautiful example because it is the very basis, it's the blueprint for what's happening in our bodies. And scientists now are recognizing this. And I just want to share with you from a very well-known scientist exactly, I want you to hear his words, the scientific words about what this means when we're seeing it. So you know it's not just me, my opinion, my theory. This is where a body of scientific thinking is now going. So here's what the scientist is saying. This is from Dr. Cohen, published in a research paper. It was released in 1984. He's a mathematician and a member of the New York Academy of Sciences. So this is a very well-credentialed scientist. And what he's saying is this, quote, he says, at the moment when the DNA-RNA system became understood, he said, the debate between evolution and creation should have come to a screeching halt because the implications of the DNA and the RNA are obvious and clear. So what he's saying is that the moment our technology advanced to the point where we could see what it takes for DNA and its complement, RNA, to work in our bodies, the complexities are so great that the evolutionary theory simply cannot explain those complexities. So he's saying this whole debate should have come to an end. It is obvious, he's saying, as a mathematician, that there is some intent, perhaps an intelligence, definitely something is directing this experience, this mechanism that is at the core of our lives. This harkens back to the very idea of our origin. Who are we? Where did we come from? What is it that combined those 2 chromosomes to produce our one, chromosome number 2? that sets us apart from all other life and makes us unique. So I'd like to take this opportunity and share with you yet another perspective. And for me, this is a very personal perspective because it involves a research project that I began over 30 years ago. My background as a scientist, as a degreed geologist with a background in marine, ocean, and life sciences and mathematics and physics, all of these things worked together for me early in my life. And when I looked at them honestly and asked myself truthfully and factually, what is nature telling us? My sense at that time, early in my life, was there is something more than evolution that underlies our existence, something that is not being acknowledged in the mainstream. And while the fossils are interesting, I don't think they're about us. And while the DNA is now telling us more information, we're still lacking a context. And this may be one of those places where we're not going to find the answer in the mystery itself, but we'll have to find the answer in other avenues that help us to understand and lead to solving this mystery. So for me, a passion of mine, as I mentioned earlier, has been to look for clues in our most ancient and cherished traditions, to see what those clues may be saying to us, or what our ancestors know in their time that we're only beginning to discover in ours. And I've always had a very strong sense that if we know where and how to look into our past, that there are insights that have been preserved in some of our most ancient texts and traditions, insights that maybe just aren't so well understood today. So I'm going to share with you very quickly, I'm going to condense 30 years of research into a project that can only happen when we cross the traditional boundaries of science and spirituality. And I was told as a scientist that these two are mutually incompatible. You must choose, I was told, the path of science or the path of spirituality, that the two were in fact mutually exclusive. Here's my thinking. We're living a time of extremes. We owe it to ourselves to draw upon every facet, every source of information possible, to give ourselves whatever it is we need and to call whatever it is that exists so that we can weave a new story, honestly answer the questions for ourselves so that we can thrive in our time of extremes, so we can end the suffering and move into a new way of living and thinking. And for me, I believe those clues exist in our past as well as in the new discoveries we're talking about now. So here's what that meant for me. I went into one of the oldest and most mysterious spiritual texts that has ever been known to exist. It is called the Sefer Yetzirah. It is a Hebrew text that is so mystical that the rabbis say it is not even something that can be studied by traditional students because the mystery is so deep and so great. It's a relatively short text, only about 1,000 lines long, and it's only been translated into English once. And I took that translation and I read through it very, very carefully as a scientist. And what I found is this: the Sefer Yetzirah is essentially a step-by-step description, as if someone, an observer, were present the day that the universe and humankind were created. An observer describing the process in line after line, 1,000 lines, what it took to get us where we are today. But the text is 3,000 years old. Whoever wrote that text, 3,000 years old, and it may be that whoever wrote it received it from a wisdom that's even older than the 3,000 years, whoever it is that put that text together, they didn't know what we know today. They didn't know about science. They didn't know about the periodic table of elements. So I began to interpret the text through the eyes of a scientist. And when the text began talking about the elements of the earth and of the wind and of the sun, I asked myself, if I were writing this text today, are those the words that I would use? And my answer was probably not. As a scientist, when I talk about the sun, rather than calling it the sun, I would refer to the most dominant element in the sun, which is hydrogen. When I talk about the air, the wind, I would refer to the most dominant element, which is oxygen. And I began to look at these overlaps. Well, there's another great mystery when it comes to to the languages of our past. Scientists know this, linguists know this very well. Every language, every single alphabet that has ever been known to exist, bar none, cuneiform, Arabic, Hebrew, Sanskrit, every Greek, every alphabet that's ever been created has always had a mysterious number linked to the letter that it represents. No one knows for sure where those numbers came from. The numbers never change. They are a constant. So the numbers that are linked to the letters of ancient alphabets, they allow us to think of those alphabets mathematically. So here's what I did as a scientist. I compared the ancient text 3,000 years old and the elements that it describes that make us with the elements of the periodic table. The ancient elements of hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon we find in the periodic table as the letters, and they have numbers associated with them. And the numbers that I linked from those ancient alphabets, as I looked at the atomic mass and the atomic weight of our elements, lo and behold, they are the same. They overlap. The atomic mass of hydrogen links precisely with very specific letters in ancient Hebrew, Arabic, and Sanskrit. The atomic mass for oxygen links precisely with letters in those ancient alphabets. So here's what I did. I replaced the letters in the ancient text with the elements of the periodic table. And when I did that and applied it to DNA, because DNA is made of hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon in different combinations. When I took the ancient alphabets and I replaced the elements of the DNA with those alphabets, the DNA began to read as you read letters in a sentence in the page upon a book. Our DNA holds a message that can only be read by crossing the traditional boundaries of science and spirituality. And it helps us one more piece with this clue of our origin. Because the very first sentence, the very first line of every strand of every human DNA says exactly the same thing. And here's what it says. When we replace those letters with the periodic table and we begin reading the text, the very first sentence in every strand of DNA literally says the words, God eternal within the body. God eternal within the body. It doesn't say who God is, how that got there, or why it's there. I'm just sharing with you what happens when we marry science and spirituality. So that gives us one more insight. Now that we know that we appeared on this earth 200,000 years ago, and we know that we haven't changed, and now that we know that the DNA that makes us who we are appears to be more than a random process of biology, the question now is, what does it mean to have that kind of DNA? What do we do with it? How do we awaken the extraordinary abilities that DNA, that fusion gives to us in our lives and gives no other form of life? In our next episode, that's what we're going to explore. So I want to thank you for joining me for this program today, and be sure to tune in for our next all-new episode of Missing Links, the deep truth of our origin, history, destiny, and fate.